Good afternoon. I'm Rory Fitzgerald. I'm Professor of Practice in Survey Research from City University of London and Director of the European Social Survey. And I'm delighted to welcome you all here for our special seminar today on the human values scale in the European Social Survey. The European Social Survey is a general cross-national social survey that's taken place every 2 years since 2002. And we collect representative samples using probability sampling techniques in those countries every 2 years to allow cross-sections to be compared. As part of that original questionnaire design for this academically led social survey, the decision was made to include the human values scale. And it particularly ties into the academic focus of the European Social Survey. And the original author of that, Shalom Schwartz, is the only academic, I think, who has a section of the questionnaire named after them. It's always referred to as the Schwartz Human Values Scale. Values, of course, something which changes at a much slower pace, arguably, than many of the other things that we measure in the ESS. Today, we'll be hearing about the relationship between human values and behaviour, the stability or otherwise over time, potential impacts for the European Union, differences between parents and non-parents, and so on. A publication that the authors in today's session have put together will be made available to all of you attending today's session. We'll also be recording the event today. It'll be made available afterwards on the ESS YouTube channel. By taking part and providing any questions into the session, you're agreeing for your questions, in a sense, to be shared on the video. Please do put your questions into the Q&A section. We'll take questions today at the end of the presentations. So without further ado, to introduce our first speaker, Shalom Schwartz is Professor of Psychology at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His individual level research includes studies on altruism, intergroup contact, individual values as determinants of political orientations, subjective well-being and pro-social behaviour, and development of values in young children, as well as differences in terms of values in terms of ethnic group, gender and religious groups, as well as value measurement. He put together the portrait scale of 21 items, which has been fielded at the end of every round of the ESS, and we're very grateful to Shalom for his contribution to the survey. So Shalom, I'll pass over to you. If you could turn on your video and share your slides, and then it's over to you.
Okay. I will. So, first, thank you, Rory, for inviting me. I'm really pleased with the way the scale has been heavily used over the years, and I hope it contributes a great deal more as time goes on. I was asked today to talk about some of the work that I'm currently doing. So I selected a study that I'm in the middle of on national differences in consensus on the priorities of values, the importance of different values, national differences on consensus within countries. Today, I'll talk a little bit about possible consequences of there being greater or lesser consensus on value priorities within countries. By consensus, I mean agreement among the citizens or residents of a country regarding which of their basic values are more and less important. Presumably, the greater the consensus in a country, the more harmony there might be among people, the more cooperation, the more stability there might be, and a variety of other things that might be good outcomes of consensus. But we did not have up until now much information on that. The types of consequences I'll be mentioning are there on the slide right now. and you can see their sources as well. These were different characteristics of countries that I pulled out that I thought might be facilitated by greater consensus within country, and also a few of the items that were in the ESS, such as the item about gays and lesbians should be free to live as they wish, where I took the country average. Now, the first study that was done on value, this is the first study done on value hierarchies. There have been studies in the past that have looked at the agreement among people with regard to their values, taking, let's say, the standard deviation within a country on the importance of each of the 10 basic values, and then just summing those standard deviations. That doesn't pay attention to the relative importance of the values for people. And as it turns out, looking at the relative importance, that is, looking at the correlation between the values of each individual and the average values in the society, and asking, well, what's the average correlation across people look like? That and what had been looked at before are uncorrelated, which in itself is interesting. But what I'm studying now is the consensus on value hierarchies. That is the extent that each person's value hierarchy looks like the value hierarchy average in the country. And I prefer looking at hierarchies because the basic argument is that people's decisions, people's attitudes, people's behaviors are a product not of one value, but of the trade-offs among the values that favor that behavior, that facilitate it or propel it, and the values that are opposed to it. You'll be hearing, for example, about attitudes toward immigrants. Now, attitudes toward immigrants are facilitated by universalism and benevolence values, concern for the welfare of others, both those you know and those who are strangers to you. But it is also opposed by a set of values that are opposing in the basic value circle, such as power, concern for power, concern for security. So because it's the trade-off among values that influences decisions, what's important is the relative importance of the different values to a person. That is a person's hierarchy, or the average hierarchy in a society. So I constructed an index of the consensus on value hierarchies for each of the European survey countries. You might be interested in knowing that consensus is highest, not surprisingly, in Finland. And it is lowest in Latvia, which has a large Russian-speaking and still Russian-affiliated set of residents. So let's take a look at what we have. But first, I want to tell you a bit about the sample. I used all of the countries in the ESS plus one sample from the United States of America. In 2012, the United States NORC gathered data from a representative American sample, and that sample is included as well. I took all of the data from rounds 1, 2, 7, and 8. If a country appeared in fewer than those 4 samples, then I took all of the samples that were available, all of the rounds that were available for that country. And in some, then we had 35 ESS countries and the United States. The justification for looking at all of the samples at once is that the hierarchy stability was quite high. Not only is value stability quite high, but the hierarchies are high as well. Looking at the 23 countries for which we had data across 12 years, that is from round 1 to round 8, the correlation for hierarchy scores was 0.78. So I, for most of the analyses, took the mean consensus score for a given country. And I related this to potential consequences. And that's what you'll see next. So to look at happiness, the correlation was 0.38, and we'll just go down these and see what we have. As you can see, for trust, we did not have data from the US. Helping a stranger, donating money, volunteering time, each of these you can see is significantly positive. The gays and lesbians particularly, and corruption in society is the strongest, though rule of law, which is similar to corruption, is also extremely strong. So all of these consequences, potential consequences, I have to say, are related to the degree of hierarchical agreement on values. But do they causally relate? They could, but the causes could also be the same. The causes for happiness and the causes for hierarchy agreement could be the same. So I also looked at a variety of potential causal relations with consensus that might also influence the consequences we've looked at above. Now, as you can see, there could be quite a few of these. For cultural heterogeneity, you might expect that the more ethnically heterogeneous countries are, the lower the consensus would be. Or linguistic heterogeneity, the larger number of groups that speak, well-sized groups, substantial groups that speak different languages, might influence the degree of consensus. Similarly with religious fractionalization. Or it might be that this is all based or largely based on the wealth distribution. That is, where there is a lot of variation in wealth, well, there would be less agreement. Or simply the levels of affluence. You can look at that in terms of just the economic part or the socioeconomic part with the Human Development Index. Or it might have to do with the political system. Is there a higher or lower degree of democratization? So we took a look at these characteristics as well. I'll just say a few things about them because this becomes very complicated. Of all of the cultural heterogeneity possibilities, ethnic, linguistic, religious, the only one that seems to be related to the degree of consensus on value priorities is ethnic heterogeneity. the fact that there are multiple religions, multiple linguistic groups, is unrelated to the heterogeneity in value priorities. Came as something of a surprise to me, I have to say, but that is the case. And the correlation is only minus 0.3. So it isn't even a very strong relationship. Now, how about Gini? How about the wealth distribution in countries? Is it the case that countries that are more diverse, that have a larger division of wealth, wealthy and poor, and the poor and the wealthy have different value priorities? Yes, there is evidence to that effect. The Gini correlation, for example, correlates 0.48. So there is some influence for that. But if you then look and ask, so could it be that Gini, that is, could it be that the wealth distribution, the wealth inequality, is impacting the hierarchy consensus? The answer appears to be, at least over 12 years, no. Doing time lag correlations, I found that there was no impact of wealth inequality on value consensus, and there was no impact of value consensus on wealth inequality. So although they are related, if there is any causal influence, it is only over a very long period. And we will see that that occurs with other things as well. If you look at straight affluence, GDP per capita, it relates strongly to the degree of consensus, as does the Human Development Index. GDP correlates 0.61, a fairly strong relationship with hierarchy consensus in a country. HDI 0.58 across these 36 countries. So we can say that it could be that the level of socioeconomic development is a strong cause of agreement on value priorities. We could think that, but in fact, if we take a good look at it, they are not over time. If you do cross-lag correlations, there is no impact of either GDP or Human Development Index on value consensus, and there is no impact of value consensus on GDP and HDI over a 12-year period, and that's all I was able to study. That is not to say that they aren't having a causal impact on each other. One might think that in countries which are more developed, you would get more consensus, or you might think you would get less, but it's clear that they are positively correlated. Yet over 12 years, we find no influence of one on the other. I might point out that if you look at the potential, the relationship between GDP and HDI, between them and consensus, that relationship, which is fairly strong, around 0.6, is totally mediated by their impact on universalism and power values. That is, high human development, high socioeconomically developed countries are countries in which people value universalism, concern for others, a great deal more than countries which are low in their socioeconomic development, and they value power considerably more than those who are in low socioeconomic development countries. And this totally mediates the relationship of country wealth, country development on hierarchical value, the value hierarchy consensus. So it is not at all clear yet what the situation is in that relationship, but it does not seem to be causal. Finally, and I won't go into it in any detail, I can say the same thing about democratization. It is substantially related to the amount of consensus in a country, more consensus under democracy. Democracy may support consensus and consensus may support democracy. But over 12 years, there is no evidence of a causal relationship. Now, in addition to studying this in the ESS, I will be undertaking a study of the same questions using the much larger sample of countries, but the much poorer measurement of values in the World Value Survey. The World Value Survey provides reasonably decent data on values for about 65 countries. But the data on values there is much inferior to the data from the European Social Survey. So there's a trade-off between the number of countries and the quality of the data. Preliminary examination of the data in the European Social Survey, in the World Values Survey, shows that the correlations, the associations, are very similar to those that appeared in the European Social Survey data. Where that will take us as far as causality, I don't know yet, but the pattern is highly similar. I think I'm going to stop here, Rory, rather than try to cover more ground, because my time is really up.
Thank you, Shalom. That was fascinating. And people are already starting to pose questions, and that's very nice the way they're doing it as well. They're putting who the questions to. So if you can do that as you go through, and Shalom will come back to questions at the end, but thanks for that fascinating presentation. And we're now going to move on to Mikko Weckroth, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Helsinki Institute of Sustainability Science, the University of Helsinki, obviously in Finland. And his research is focused on empirical analysis of geographies on subjective well-being, human values, and urbanization, as well as their interconnections. So welcome to Mikko.
All right, I assume that you are able to see the first slide. First, thanks to Rory and Stefan and all the other ESS people for providing this marvelous data set. I'm actually, I was happy to use ESS data throughout all the research in my PhD, which is now already a few years ago, but nonetheless, and actually I have been working with quite constantly afterwards as well. I have encountered other data sets, but as well, obviously on survey data, but commonly I seem to be missing ESS because of its quality, but also the fact that it includes the human value scale, because it's such a rich addition to standard socioeconomic stuff in order to understand the behavior of individuals and societies. But it's 50 minutes. It's a short time. I will start the presentation. I'm going to start my own clock as well in order to time. I have structured the presentation mainly kind of three parts. I will first go through the kind of common framework what I, as a geographer, as a quantitative geographer, start with when looking empirically towards the geography of human values or other dimension in ESS. Then we'll present some of the key results, which are of my previous work, which are also displayed in this booklet on the ESS findings, and close then with a few notes on certain research topics or themes within the geography of human values, or maybe in more general, the topical themes in human geography as such, where I would see that the concept and measure of human value is especially relevant. As I said, first some notes on what the geography of human values would look like empirically, and kind of as a strategy for research. Geographers, as I see in practice, kind of the discipline of geography, it's kind of a perspective or complementary perspective to certain theories or concepts within the social sciences. Some other geographers might get angry of this big reductive approach to geography, but that's how I would see it in empirical terms. And then if we look, for example, the concept and the measure of subjective well-being, which I have been using through ESS, one of trying to do the geographical analysis, always are happy kind of if geography matters even a little bit. For example, we know that the socioeconomic indicators are much more stronger predictors for whatever outcome or dependent variable you're looking at. But if there is some significant effect in geographical dimension, then kind of geographers are happy, and geographical approach can kind of somehow justify itself and complement the other approaches. Then the geography matters argument can be divided into two dimensions. We could look at the subnational variation. That's kind of the first claim to the fame of the geography, is to argue that there might be spatial variation also within countries, not just between. Of course, if you're comparing countries, that's also geography, but kind of in a fixed scale. And in technical terms, we would be talking about NUTS indicators in ESS, which vary depending the country and its scale from 1 to 3. But as I have understood the logic in ESS, they are aiming roughly to the same land areas. So, for example, we are using ESS NUTS 3, whereas in Germany it's NUTS 1. Another geographical approach, which is of course overlapping with the previous one, is to focus at the urban-rural differences, the big city versus smaller residencies, and then we would be working in a case of ESS with the domicile variable. Then if one would be able to observe geographical differences in certain attribute, for example, subjective well-being, then kind of the next question is that whether these differences are due to the so-called contextual effects or place-based effects, or are they merely reflections of spatial concentration of socioeconomic variables, meaning that certain people with certain kind of socioeconomic backgrounds or values would be self-selected to certain locations. This is kind of very important distinction to make if you are looking at the geography of human values or well-being. That's pretty much the framework we are dealing with, and which I have been applying in my PhD thesis and afterwards as well. And I have to say that it's kind of coming from geography, it's very interdisciplinary approach, but there's small number, where the scarcity of analysis doing utilizing the concept and measure of human values with the certain topics within a human geography, which is in some sense, of course, a good thing. There's a gap in knowledge, but then again, it's a bit lonely field to be wandering between disciplines and also in a small section of geography per se. But then, since it seems to be possible to do some kind of geography of human values, what does it look like empirically in my work? This is kind of the reflection of the first option to do in the regional comparisons. And then we would utilize the NUTS, the regional indicator used by the EU and also luckily by the ESS. And then if your geographer can produce maps, or if you have a colleague who can produce maps, that's good enough. You can do this kind of stuff. And once visualizing this spatial variation, the first thing is to interpret somehow these differences. And then kind of approaching from the broader scale, the first pattern, which can be distinguished from these three values, the self-direction, power, and achievement. One could, for example, look at the East-West division, because we know that it's significant division for any analysis of the European Union and Europe. And there, I think it's quite easy to distinguish regarding the power and achievement values, the clusters between East and West Europe, these are, of course, not the huge surprises. Kind of zooming in, you would be able to recognize regimes. For example, Scandinavian or Nordic countries are quite homogeneous in many scales that appear to be also regarding human values. But then again, there are some national differences as well. For example, if you look at the power value orientation, there's a clear distinction between Finland and Sweden. So interpreting these maps is not that easy, but in some areas or some geographical areas, kind of the picture makes perfect sense. And in this case, meaning that they are clear and robust geographical patterns that go along with the theory, what one would assume. And in this case, that would be emerging from the Iberian Peninsula, that being Spain and Portugal, because there's clearly these differences between Spain and Portugal. One could say that Spain is kind of more developed or more Western, but compared to Portugal, but as addition, there's a very clear and persistent pattern of north-south, Portugal. These maps are from one analysis I did with my colleague Teemu Kemppainen, a sociologist, and we wanted to predict the regional GDP with these aggregates of value orientations. And here we had also a map on regional GDP, and if you would compare the Iberian case to this map, it would look the map on the regional GDP, it would look absolutely the same, the northwest pattern. So in some cases it makes perfect sense, but and also there are some kind of anomalies which we need to explain somehow. And in this specific analysis, we focused at London, because within the Western context, especially the UK, we all know that it's especially high in the GDP, but regarding the value climate, so to speak, it resembles more the Eastern Eastern Europe, which I think it's not a surprise, having some preliminary knowledge about the kind of the inequality issues in London and how special that is within the UK context. I would be even surprised that London being the capital of the capital and the kind of the site of the money, it would not be reflected in the value climate. But then another dimension, as the addition to the interregional, which is a core topic in human geography, is to look at the urban-rural distinguishing. And here would be, as I said, and as you know, we would be using the domicile indicator in the ESS. And these stats, which are showing the unadjusted value dimensions between the different domiciles, they're obviously not a huge surprise for anyone having any kind of common knowledge about the stereotypes between the urban and rural. As one would expect, we find the differences in the broader conservation values to be the largest between different domiciles. And also, as the circumplex structure of the Schwartz scale has this bipolar dimension, it's also not a surprise that this picture is kind of reversed in the openness to change compared to the conservatism. In self-strandedness, there is maybe, as one would expect, that there is no distinguished urban-rural differences. But kind of theoretically, my personal favorite of these results is the self-enhancement pattern. Even though the confidence intervals do overlap, there's still quite a clear pattern in this dimension. And this simple graph kind of taps into the very certain core theories within human geography and urban geography and urban sociology, but maybe in a broader social science in general, because we all know that the cities are kind of the sites of the interpersonal rivalry and kind of, so to speak, the mentality associated with the capitalism, and especially in this era of knowledge-intensive economy. I seem to be not that terrible regarding the time. A few minutes left. Few areas which I see the geography of human values to be especially relevant. First, urban-rural differences, which is some other topic I have been working as addition to the geography of human values. Because as you most likely know, if you look at the country correlations, the rich countries have a higher life satisfaction or other measure of subjective well-being. But if you look at the subnational urban-rural differences, this pattern is kind of reversed. Then again, the question becomes how much this pattern, reversed pattern, is related to the concept of value dissonance, meaning that could it be the explanation that within the urban areas there are people with having more rural values, and they are then negatively affected. Another one comes from the economic geography, which is kind of obvious as well and easily integrated to the analysis, meaning that with the human value scale, we are unable to look at the human capital contributions to the economic growth in regional scale. And finally, final note, we all know as a social scientist or anyone who reads about news that the emergence of populism, maybe especially the right-wing populism throughout Europe and Western countries all over the world, is quite an important issue at the moment. in general, as I have read the literature, it has been explained kind of either economic or cultural explanations, and which both have clearly strong urban-rural differences. But the small and emerging literature on the geography of populism has only discussed the economic dimension, approaching from the structural change, the change in the structure of the economy, unemployment, etc. But obviously there is a potentially not a distinct, but as addition the economic explanations, cultural ones, which we could approach with the concept of human values. Obviously, these are all areas which I have been doing research or doing one at the moment. Especially the last one is on my table at the moment. I think I've used my time since I can see Rory opening up his video. So thank you. Thanks for this.
Thank you, Mikko. Wonderful presentation. I really like the graphics, and we'll come back to the discussion at the end. Very interesting findings as well about London. As London, I was very interested to see where we fitted in with those comparisons. We'll move straight on now to Daniel Seddig, sociologist at the Institute of Sociology and Social Psychology at the University of Cologne in Germany. And his research interests are comparative analysis of human values, crime, health, immigration, aging, as well as surveying methods and structural equation modeling. So welcome to Daniel, and hand straight over to you.
Thank you. So I hope you can all see me, or at least see the slides. So you should now be able to see the slides.
We can see them. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I would like to thank everyone involved for the invitation and opportunity to present our work at this event. As you can see, we have several authors here on the title slide, meaning that I am here today on behalf of our team to present our results, which are essentially based on an article that we were able to publish in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies. Now, our goal was to examine the extent to which human values are related to attitudes towards immigration in Europe, and to what extent the mechanisms that connect values and attitudes are mediated via people's perceptions of threat due to immigration. Then on the social macro level, we were interested in whether the mechanisms show a similar pattern across European countries, and whether cultural value preferences somehow direct these mechanisms. Now, we're all aware that immigration has been and continues to be a top priority topic for intensive discussions in Europe, and that immigration is being perceived by many as a threat to the social order and social cohesion in host societies. So there is a growing body of literature suggesting that negative attitudes towards immigration are strong or on the rise in recent years. And the scientific explanations about what drives people to oppose immigration and hold negative attitudes suggest that individual and country level factors are active simultaneously. Studies that focus on the individual level have named factors such as economic vulnerability, unemployment, low income, or low levels of education as antecedents of perceived economic threat due to immigration. So mainly tapping into the notion of immigrants posing as competitors for resources. Likewise, political conservatism and right-wing ideology are assumed to mobilize negative attitudes by increasing perceptions of symbolic threats. So tapping into the notion of immigrants posing as a threat to traditions, norms, and cultural hegemony. On the country level, explanations have focused on structural attributes such as economic conditions, the size of the immigrant population, integration policies, or major events like terrorist attacks that have happened in a country. Notwithstanding the importance of these factors, we assume that human values influence the emergence and maintenance of attitudes, negative attitudes towards immigration as well. And the literature shows quite consistently that universalism values in particular, so those stressing concern for others, are associated with positive attitudes towards immigration, whereas conservation values, so those referring to the importance of tradition and customs and conformity, are associated with negative values, and that these associations exist across various societal contexts. So now the task was, or it is still, to bring together human values, perceptions of threat, and attitudes towards immigration theoretically. We can start by looking at human values, which are defined as desirable trans-situational goals varying in importance that serve as guiding principles. So following this concept of values, they are very general and basic beliefs referring to general situations, whereas threat and opposition to immigration refer to rather specific feelings and assessments of a specific social phenomenon. So theories about values and attitudes lead us to expect that the causal direction operates from the general to the specific, and that the mechanisms linking values and attitudes rest on the human motivation to engage in behaviors or embrace attitudes that help realize certain values. And if such attitudes are in agreement with the most prioritized values, people are more likely to express these attitudes, and if not, they are more likely to have a negative stance. And so finally, threat or perceptions thereof may emerge when people feel that the goals behind their values are at stake. And at this point, let me clarify, we expected that universalism and conservation values are more responsive to aspects of symbolic threat rather than economic threat, and therefore we directed our attention towards symbolic threat. And anytime I mention threat now, I'm referring to symbolic threat. So following these considerations, the hypotheses of our study were, first, people who endorse universalism values show lower levels of perceived threat and more support for immigration. Second, people who endorse conservation values show higher levels of perceived threat and less support for immigration. Now, the mechanisms are related to how immigrants are being perceived, with many of them certainly bringing different and new customs and traditions to their host countries. So for conservative people, or those who stress conservation values and their motivation to protect customs and traditions, it is more likely to feel threatened, and therefore expressing less support for immigration is a form of value expression for them. And by way of contrast, universalistic individuals who are motivated by the need to understand other people and show tolerance are less likely to feel threatened, and they endorse immigration. Third, we can see that perceived threat was assumed to reduce support for immigration and mediate the effects of values. Now, why a mediation? Well, we think that perceptions and feelings are more immediate antecedents of attitudes than values, and that therefore the mechanisms by which values affect attitudes operate via threat. Finally, we assume that cultural value preference on the country level can change the strength of the associations among values, threat, and attitudes. And in particular, we assumed that the degree of cultural embeddedness in a society would lower the strength of the associations, because solidarity and identification with the collective may be stronger than the importance of people's own goals, and that by way of contrast, people in more autonomous societies tend to express their own views and preferences more easily. So we added several control variables into our considerations, and we wanted to examine whether there are differences in the pattern of associations across European countries. Let me quickly go through the data and measures section here. So obviously we used data from the European Social Survey. It was the 7th round. We could use data from 19 countries. The dependent variable was the attitude towards immigration. So people were asked whether they would be willing to allow immigrants into the country when they were of the same race or ethnic group, of a different race or ethnic group, or from poorer countries outside Europe. Our mediator was perceived symbolic threat. So people were asked to assess whether a country's cultural life was undermined or enriched by immigrants, immigrants make the country a worse or better place to live, or whether they think that religious beliefs and practices are undermined or enriched by immigrants. The two human values, universalism and conformity tradition, were taken, of course, from the Portrait Values questionnaire, and we combined conformity and tradition because it's hardly possible to separate them empirically. And we decided not to include security, the security value, due to the differences in the motivational foundations, which may not be as strongly responsive towards cultural and symbolic aspects of threat. And the analysis was based on a multiple group structural equation model. So these are the results. Certainly a multiple group model produces a large number of coefficients. So for this presentation, I tried to break down the main findings into graphs in which I represent the range of standardized regression coefficients from countries in which the respective effects were significant. So this is the first model, which is a fairly simple model and does only contain the two values and the allow dependent variable. And according to our expectations, we see that universalism positively affects allowing immigrants in, with effects ranging from 0.13 to 0.50, and they are significant in all countries. Moreover, we see that the effects of conformity tradition on allow are negative and significant in 16 countries, so in the majority of countries, ranging from -0.8 to -0.30. Now, in the second model, we introduced perceived threat as a mediator, which has a strong negative effect on allow in all countries. And this goes along with a considerable reduction also in the effect sizes of both values on the allow dependent variable, and the number of significant direct effects that remain is considerably lower than in the first model. However, this does, of course, not imply that values are rendered less or even unimportant once threat is considered, because, as we see here, both values affect threat perception. Universalism leads to less threat experience and conservation leads to more threat experience. Thus, we can see that the hypothesized mediation is supported with indirect significant effects in all countries, although it should be mentioned that especially universalism also remained a meaningful direct predictor of opposition to immigration in many countries. Now, what about the cross-country variability in these associations with regard to variability of cultural values? Well, to answer this question, we chose, I would say, a rather simple strategy by computing correlations between the cultural values embeddedness and affective and intellectual autonomy on the one hand, and the effect sizes of the two values on threat and allow from the mediation model on the other hand. And the results indicate that the associations between values and threat were stronger in more autonomous countries and weaker, a little weaker, in more embedded countries. And although the differences were not overly large and not significant for the effect of values on the allow variable down here, we carefully interpreted the findings as a sort of a moderation, although not technically, of course, meaning individuals in embedded societies may be more inclined to adapt to collective social standards and to the collective, and therefore the expression and the pursuit of realizing personal values may be less pronounced. Whereas in more autonomous societies, people are more oriented towards expressing and pursuing their goals, hence there's a stronger effect of personal values on threat perceptions. So to sum this up, the results underline the importance of human values for the formation of threat and attitudes on the immigration debate across Europe. The mechanisms relating values to attitudes was mediated via people's feelings of symbolic threat due to immigration, which is lower for universalistic individuals who are likely to be more open towards newcomers, and higher for conservative individuals who oppose societal change. However, there is, of course, never a clear-cut distinction between universalistic and conservative people. what we have unraveled here is rather a trade-off, just as Shalom Schwartz mentioned earlier, between more or less prioritized values. So theoretically and empirically, you will, for example, find that aspects of universalism correlate with aspects of conservation. So this is not clearly distinguishable. Finally, we saw that the cultural context in which individuals operate seems to moderate, for lack of a better term in this case, the formation of negative attitudes. And considering that we have a rough idea about which countries are more embedded than others, may also be interesting for future research to dive deeper into the particular details of differences between particular cultural regions. Okay, many thanks for your attention. I can stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you, Daniel. That was very, very clear, very nice presentation. And just a reminder, if you have questions for any of the authors, you can put them in the Q&A facility here in Zoom, and we'll come to those shortly. And now we'll move on to our last speaker, Andrew Miles, an assistant professor of sociology from the University of Toronto. And his work lies at the intersection of the sociology of culture, social psychology, and moral and cognitive psychology. And his research focuses on the social development of different moral cultures and the role moral constructs like values and identity play in predicting behaviour. So welcome, Andrew, and over to you.
All right. Well, if everything has gone well, you should be able to see my introductory slide now. So let's dive in. My guess is that if you were here today and if you sat through any of these presentations, then you know that there's a lot of interesting work going on around people's personal values, as well as their cultural values and other things. And you probably, or perhaps are convinced as I am, that personal values matter. And so this naturally raises the question, if personal values matter, where do they come from? Now, interestingly, amidst all of the other fascinating work that's been done, this question in particular has received relatively less attention, not no attention, but less. And so I started to investigate this a number of years ago. My basic, here we go. I started with a pretty basic idea, which is that people's personal values are likely to be shaped by the experiences that they have in life, which in turn are going to be shaped in part by their social location. So for instance, the experience of being a woman likely differs than the experience of being a man. And the experience of being a rich business person probably differs quite a bit from the experience of being a poor academic. And so based on these basic ideas, I started to do some research and I found some patterns, right? I found that personal values related to people's social locations in interesting ways. The challenge was that a few other people had done similar analyses and they got different answers. Not completely different, but they had enough difference that made me wonder what's going on here. And so then through a process that is too long and tortured to bore you with right now, I eventually arrived here. Now, this is actually a theoretical diagram taken from a piece written by Shalom Schwartz. I didn't even come up with this. And it is, in my view, probably the clearest articulation of Schwartz's thinking on where values come from. Though bits and pieces of this, I think, reflect the theoretical ideas of other scholars as well. Now, this section here is roughly corresponds to what I'd been paying attention to, right? So you have institutions in society, right? Family somebody belongs to, how much education they receive, and so on. These correspond to their social location. They sort of define where they sit in society, and that these then affect their personal values. But what about all of this stuff above the red box? What this says, in short, is that different societies have different cultures, including cultural values, which are in turn shaped by things like the unique history of a country, its ecology, and so on. Now, the important implication of this, at least for this particular project, is that these cultural values, or because these cultural values shape how these institutions in society operate, that means that these institutions can have different effects on values in different places. or to put that in the terms that I was using earlier, what it means to be, say, a racial minority or to be rich. It differs across societies, and hence being a racial minority or a rich person and so on can give you different experiences and hence shape your values in different ways. So if this is true, this would help to explain the differences in the results that I got as compared to some of my colleagues. It turned out, for instance, that we were using different samples. So it could be that we both got the right answer. It's just that the right answer differed across contexts. Now, as an interesting and I think important aside, this is something that I hadn't even really considered. I at first thought there were like methodological reasons for the differences. But what that means is I'd been implicitly assuming that social locations had universal effects on values. So I decided to test this, right, to test this explicitly. And I'll note that more than simply being a way to gratify my curiosity, which it was, testing for variation in effects also serves, I think, as an important test of this values framework here. So it probably comes as no surprise by this point, I decided to test this using European Social Survey data. But this was a good choice because, as you've heard, the European Social Survey contains measures of values. It also contains a number of demographic variables, which do a really good job, I think, of pointing to some of the consequential social differences that will correspond to people's different social locations. Now, I used data from the first 8 rounds of the European Social Survey. That gave me, somewhere close to 400,000 respondents from 32 different countries. Now, the key task is to estimate the effect of each of these demographic variables on each of these values, and then to see if that effect varies across countries. So to do that, I used models of this form. This is a linear multi-level model. It includes individuals who are grouped by countries. So for each value type, I would estimate a model, and that model would include all of these demographic predictors as independent variables. And then I would take one of those independent variables, one of these demographics, and include a random slope, which would allow us to examine whether or not there was variation across countries. Now, in order to figure out whether this variation was substantive or significant, I then fit an identical model, except it didn't have a random slope. And then I compared the fit of both of these models to the data. The idea being, whichever model fits the data the best is more likely to reflect reality. Now, there are lots of ways to measure fit of a statistical model to the data. If you're happy to talk about all of the reasons I chose what I'm about to show you, we can do that during the Q&A. But for the sake of moving things along, I'll just say I use something called the Bayesian Information Criteria, or BIC, and I used a rule of thumb that says when you have 2 models that differ in their BIC scores by at least 2 units, then you can say that they have like a real difference in fit to the data. And so for me, the question was, does this model that allows for variation fit the data better, or this model down here that does not allow for variation fit the data better? Now, in theory, I could have tested this with 1 round of European Social Survey data, right? So I have, say, in the first round of the European Social Survey, we have 10 values, 12 different demographic predictors, which sort of index these social locations. That's 120 different effects, which I could then have seen, for each of those 120 effects, does it vary across countries? However, that I think would have been doing a great disservice to the European Social Survey, because well, let me say it this way, it would not have been making full use of the potential of the European Social Survey, because these values and these demographics have been included in every round. What that means is I can repeat this analysis 8 times, with the end result being a really quite robust understanding of whether social location effects do or do not vary across countries. So what do we find? This chart shows the proportion of those 120 effects that vary across nations, the proportion that do not vary across nations, and then the cases where the data were just sort of too close to call. What we see, looking just for the moment at the first round of the ESS, is that in the majority of cases, the data suggests that effects do in fact vary across countries. In about 11% of those cases, we see evidence that they don't, and then we just couldn't tell in about 4% of cases. Now, all of the rest of these rows of the table repeat the same analysis, essentially replicate the analysis in rounds 2 through 8. And what do we see? Well, we see some variation in the numbers, which is what we'd expect because they're slightly different sample compositions, different countries to some degree in each round. However, the overall pattern is the same. The vast majority of effects seem to vary. Now, if we compress these by looking at the median proportions of the varying effects and the non-varying effects across all 8 rounds of the 8 rounds of the survey, this is what we get, right? About 84% of the effects vary, about 12% of the effects don't vary, and about 4% we couldn't really tell. Now, this is, I think, quite strong support for the claim that social locations have different effects in different countries. Again, maybe not all of these effects, but the majority. And I think this provides good support for lack of a better term, what I'm calling Schwartz's value development theory. Now, it turns out that there's actually another way, and I promise this is the final way, that I'm going to test this theory using these data. And to see what it is, we're going to go back to this theoretical diagram. Now, the effects of social locations are thought to vary based on these cultural values. This is what we've talked about, suggesting that the effects of these institutions will vary across countries, which is what we've just seen. The other implication of this, or at least one other implication of this, I should say, is that to the extent that these national level cultures and other national level features of culture vary, or I should say, sorry, they vary, but to the extent that they don't vary, to the extent that they're similar, what we should see is that the effects of these institutions on personal values should be similar. The logic being is if I'm in one country and it's pretty similar culturally to another country, then what it means to be in a particular social location should also be pretty similar. We'd have similar experiences, and hence the effect of being in that social location on someone's values should be pretty similar. Now, it's quite fortunate that value theorists have actually done quite a lot of work at looking at these national level cultural similarities. And there are a number of typologies out there that talk about which countries form these sort of cultural groups. And they tend to refer to these either as cultural regions or cultural zones. They have a couple of different names. For our purposes, I decided to focus on 2 that I think are pretty widely known. One of these is a typology by Ronald Inglehart, and one of them is a typology by Shalom Schwartz. There's a fair bit of overlap between these typologies, but there's also some differences. So we can consider each as a way of operationalizing this idea of shared culture. Now, the task is to determine if these cultural zones help us to explain that variation in effects across nations. So what I did is I fit statistical models that predict this variation in effects, and some of those statistical models included cultural zones and some of them did not. And the crucial question is this: does a model that includes measures of one of these 2 types of cultural zones, does that fit the data better than one without? If so, that suggests that these cultural zones are helping to explain this cross-national variation in effects, which is exactly what the theory would predict. So what we have on this page are actually all 120 of those effects divided into panels and columns. So for instance, right here, we have all of the effects having to do with income, and then each of these columns in here is the relationship of income to one of the values, and you can see the values listed right over here. Now, the actual height of these points represents the difference in fit between a model that does and does not include cultural zones, with higher values representing more support for cultural zones. In other words, it fits the data better. Now, just eyeballing what we have here, we can see that the majority of cases fall above the line, suggesting support for the idea that cultural zones help to improve the fit. I should mention as well that we have two lines, right, in each of these panels, because I'm using two different typologies for these cultural zones, Schwartz and Engelhardt. Okay, so just from looking at this, we can see that in most, but not all cases, right, including these cultural zones, seems to improve our understanding of variation. If we aggregate across, we find that, I'll just skip down here for the sake of time. If we consider either Schwartz's or Engelhardt's scheme, it's about 81% of these effects are improved, right? The variation is better explained when we consider cultural zones. So this, I think, quite strongly supports the claim that cultural values pattern the way that social locations relate to people's personal values, which is consistent with Schwartz's value development theory. So where does that leave us? Well, we've seen that how people's personal values relate to their social locations does in fact vary cross-nationally. And this held across many different types of values and many different types of social locations, and it replicated 8 times in large independent samples. Now, this sort of cuts against that original assumption that I'd made, even without thinking about it really, that there are lots and lots of universals in the way that social locations relate to people's values. Now, there might be some, but this suggests to me that that should not be our default assumption. We also saw that there are these cultural similarities between nations that help to explain the variation in these effects. And both of these points, I think, in different ways, support this value development theory that Schwartz outlined. And I'll go ahead and stop there. Thanks so much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Very nice presentation. If you could stop sharing your screen, please. And maybe if everyone just keep their cameras on for some questions. First of all, a couple of questions that have come in directly for Shalom Schwartz. The first one, is there any relationship between the Malraux-Crown social desirability scale and the 10 basic human values? And is there any way to operationalize social desirability based on items, including the 21 item version of your scale? You able to turn your camera back on, Shalom?
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I don't know if my camera's on, but I'm not muted anymore. Yes, there's even been research done on the topic. Generally speaking, I'll get my video on, yes. Okay, the host has stopped my video, it says.
I don't think we have.
Okay,
we can see you now, brilliant.
Okay. Crown-Marlowe social desirability or various other measures of social desirability are without a doubt related to the 10 basic values. And not only for methodological reasons, in fact, not primarily because of a methodological issue, but on conceptual grounds. People for whom conformity values are particularly important are also going to be people for whom social desirability is particularly important, because social desirability is trying to be seen by others in the way you think they want to see you, and that means conforming to others' expectations. And there are negative relationships between social desirability, various measures of it, and self-direction values, which are values in which people wish to assert their own independence and their own ways of seeing things, regardless of how others may see them. So yes, there is a correlation. That correlation is primarily conceptual, not methodological. And you might, though I wouldn't use values as a measure of social desirability, if you wanted to, you could at least make the assumption that openness values, and in particular self-direction, do reflect low social desirability, and conservation values, particularly conformity, do reflect a higher level of social desirability. But they aren't a very good measure. I don't remember the correlations offhand, but they're far from being convincing as an adequate measure of social desirability.
Thanks, Shalom. Just before we move to the next question, and in a moment, we're going to be putting a link to the publication that's come from today's presentations in the chat. So you'll be able to get access our top lines findings there. Another question, it is to Shalom, but others might want to come in as well. There's a lot of talk in today's politics about polarization, for example, with Brexit. Would political polarization in the country be reflected in low value consensus? And is there any evidence of decreasing value consensus in recent times, for example, after 2015? Shalom, if you want to go first, but then perhaps others might like to.
Okay, I would have to look back in my data to see whether there has been a drop over time, but as I recall, the answer is no. If there has been a drop, it's been quite small. Whether polarization would be reflected in values, in theory, I would say yes, but I do not have evidence for that. We don't find that countries that are particularly polarized, you can take your choice. I don't know which ones you have in mind. For me, that would, well, the US data that I know are from 2012, so I can't really answer that. But in theory, yes, I would expect that the greater polarization would lead to less value consensus. And interestingly, it's a good topic to try to tackle while looking at political views. It should be possible to pinpoint people who are highly conservative and highly liberal and see the degree to which there is lack of consensus in their value hierarchies. And the answer to that is definitely there is, because we know their values very much differ on the two critical values related to consensus, and that is power and universalism. Universalism being substantially higher on the left, and power substantially higher on the right.
Does any of the other panelists want to come in on that question? Mikko?
I could probably play the usual geographical card here, because when we talk about the polarization of societies, I think this is clearly a case where the spatial issue matters. For example, the example I gave on the populism, which is one of the most extreme example or visible sample of the polarization. And I don't know if we can, with the ESS data, find empirical evidence strong for that, but as Professor Schwartz mentioned, obviously in theoretical sense, it's there. It's very strong.
Mikko, if only to reinforce what you're saying, if we look at the data on which countries are high in consensus and which low, the biggest differences between Western Europe and Eastern Europe. It's not only Latvia that's very low, but Russia is very low. And it's not only Finland that's very high, it's the other Scandinavian and France that are very high in consensus. So from that point of view, yes, there are some data.
Yeah, and actually, if I could comment on that, I think one of the possible causal effects for the consensus could be the spatial or regional, because as you said, as we know in Eastern Europe, the division between the urban centers and rural, they are huge concerning the maybe mentality or values as well, but the simple infrastructure. So there's most likely a regional component there as well.
Okay. The next question, do you think values would predict compliance with coronavirus restrictions during the pandemic, or alternatively, are you aware of any studies where this has been looked at?
There are studies underway, but I don't know the results. It sure does look like it should be that way.
Okay. Next question, again for Shalom. Have you looked at the influence of value hierarchy consensus on political variables such as affective polarization, government stability, etc.?
Well, there is data on stability, but did I cite that? Yeah, well, the rule of law is about perceiving that people have confidence in the law and have confidence in the government and abide by the laws of the government. And that is strongly predicted by values. I think the prediction was something like 0.6. It's not a full answer to the question because I don't know about the other parts of it.
Thank you. Next question, would you say that your theory and empirical evidence of value development agrees with the social development theory of Patricia Grenfell? I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, Shalom.
Okay, I don't remember Patricia's work all that well. I do remember having an argument with her about that. So I don't know the answer, but I suspect that there is some real disagreement there.
If you don't mind, I can jump in. I haven't read as deeply in Greenfield's work as I probably ought to have, but my sense was similar, right? If I'm remembering correctly, Greenfield really links the development of values, again, still to social positions, but then she ties it really to like economic development in society, such that as societies develop, the distribution of these demographic categories changes, and that's what leads to these changes versus kind of this national level culture with influences running down. I think it leads to some differences in predictions. But anybody who is more familiar, if I've horribly misrepresented her work, please let me know.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, another member of the audience has put 3 questions in. We'll see if we can get through them. There's been a long discussion about the problem of measuring values at an aggregate level, such as at the one of national cultures. Some of this might be related to the discussion on consensus. However, for some studies, we need to compare individual and aggregated values for each country in a simple way. Should we use the average or any other indicator of cultural value to compare to the individual value?
Anyone else want to tackle this? It's a real thicket. I always compare using aggregates and not using the individual variables, not using the individual values, but that's because I am trying to represent the cultures of the countries and not the values of the individuals. And this gets very messy, but there is an assumption built into the aggregates, which is that if you have national representative samples, then you have a sample of the culture to which all of the people are exposed. And the aggregate picks up what people are exposed to. And that is a hypothetical variable, which I call the culture. We don't measure culture directly. And that hypothetical variable is represented by the aggregate. The average of individual values One of my colleagues, Michael Bond, coined the term the citizens' values in order to distinguish it from the cultural values. But the theoretical arguments around this are very, very controversial. Engelhardt takes one position and kind of ignores the issue entirely, as does Hofstadter, and I just struggle with it, but I wouldn't say that I have solved it. But the distribution of values, when you take country aggregates, the relations among values are not exactly the same as they are when you look at the relations among individuals. And it's because of that that it's one can argue that they are two different things, the aggregates and the individual values. But there are those who say, no, that's really just measurement error and it's all the same thing. And you can use the individual values to represent countries or to represent nuts, if you will. And you have 10 values at the country, culture, or subculture level. And it's an unresolved question, I would say, right now.
Thanks, Shalom. Question for Daniel. Might the implications of your analysis be that if a country wanted to smooth the kind of integration of immigrants more smoothly, that, and it's a very conservative country, that to sort of reassure the conservatives that you might try to highlight how immigrants would be made to feel welcome in a way which meant that they were also encouraged to embrace the culture of where they were coming in? Would that help to reduce the threat? Is that the implication of your findings?
I don't know for sure. We are thinking a lot lately about the implications of the values research with regard to immigration aspects and how to maybe, let's say, optimize communication strategies within countries to make it more acceptable also for those who are not jumping on the universalistic wagon to accept it and to live with it. And I think it has to do a lot with I haven't read much about it, but with the issue of values instantiation. So how to use values and to really activate them, maybe in communication strategies, in order for them to be effective in decision making and in building up attitudes or reducing negative attitudes. So that would be a short answer.
I think that's very interesting. I remember speaking to Julie Lee, who's done a lot of work in values in Australia, and that was her perspective, that by learning more about values, you could think about communication. So it could be, for example, in the future, if you were concerned about compliance with coronavirus rules, for example, that maybe you need to think more about your communications for different groups rather than having a one-size-fits-all communication strategy. So I think that's one of the ways in which this values research might have practical implications as well. Okay, we've got time for one more question. I'm just going in here now.
So there were some questions in the chat with regard to the immigration topic, which I've already answered. So you can read in the chat.
They've already been answered. You've done those. Yeah.
No, not in the chat, in the question answer.
There is also one other very long question, but I might ask Shalom to answer that on and afterwards, because the question itself is quite long. So coming to the end of the session today, so just like to thank all of the speakers for their wonderful presentations. Stefan Swift, the Media and Communications Officer, thanking him as well for setting today up, and he has now published the link to the top lines in the chat, and we'll also email that around to you afterwards. The talks will be available online with the recordings. And this is clearly an area of great interest in the ESS. The value scale is used extensively. So we hope there'll be many more opportunities to come together and discuss this in future. But thanks again to all of our speakers and to everyone for joining us this afternoon, and have a lovely day.